this baby's heartbeat. Syncs with bare rhythms. Science can't explain their bond. The cabin sat nestled between the towering pines, their branches swaying in a rhythm only the forest understood. Ethan Marshall carried the last box through the doorway, his breath forming small clouds in the crisp mountain air. His wife, Lily Morgan, followed, cradling their 3-month-old son Leo against her chest. The baby's tiny fingers curled around the edge of her wool sweater. They had come here seeking peace, a place far from the constant hum of the city, where they could raise their child surrounded by nature's quiet wisdom. The real estate agent had called it rustic, but to them, it felt like coming home to a place they had never been before. That first night, something unusual happened. Leo, who typically fussed through his bedtime routine, settled into an unprecedented calm. His breathing deepened, matching a rhythm that seemed to pulse through the very walls of the cabin. Lily noticed it first, pressing her ear against the baby's chest, then looking at Ethan with confusion dancing in her eyes. The heartbeat was steady, but it carried an echo, as if responding to something beyond the room. Ethan dismissed it as mountain acoustics, the way sound traveled differently in thin air, but Lily knew her child's rhythms like she knew her own breath. This was different. This was new. The following morning brought no answers, only more questions. Leo woke without his usual cries, his eyes wide and alert, tracking something invisible across the ceiling. His tiny chest rose and fell in that same peculiar pattern, a rhythm that seemed to pull from somewhere deep in the earth. Ethan checked the baby monitor, wondering if perhaps it was picking up interference from some nearby equipment, but the screen showed only their peaceful child, his heartbeat displaying that strange, steady pulse. When Lily lifted Leo to feed him, she felt it again, that subtle thrumming that seemed to pass through her son and into her own chest, making her heart skip before finding its normal pace again. They tried to go about their day normally, unpacking boxes and arranging furniture, but both parents found themselves repeatedly drawn back to Leo's crib. The baby lay there, more content than they had ever seen him, his eyes following patterns in the air that only he could see. By afternoon, Ethan had pulled out his phone, recording Leo's breathing, trying to capture evidence of what they were experiencing. The video showed nothing unusual, just a baby breathing. But when he played it back, there was something in the background, a low-frequency hum that hadn't been audible in the moment. Lily suggested calling the pediatrician, but what would they say? That their perfectly healthy baby had developed a mysterious rhythm? That the forest seemed to be breathing through him? As evening approached, the phenomenon intensified. Leo's heartbeat grew stronger, more pronounced, until they could almost see his tiny chest vibrating with each pulse. Ethan placed his hand on the baby's stomach, feeling the rhythm transfer into his palm, traveling up his arm like a gentle electric current. It wasn't unpleasant, quite the opposite actually. It felt ancient, primal, like touching something that had existed long before humans walked these mountains. Lily brought over the stethoscope they kept in their first aid kit, listening intently to Leo's heart. What she heard made her gasp softly. It wasn't just one heartbeat. There were two distinct rhythms, perfectly synchronized, as if Leo's heart was keeping time with something else entirely. The sun began to set, painting the mountains in shades of amber and purple when they first saw it. Through the large window that faced the forest, a shape emerged from between the trees. At first, Ethan thought it was just shadows playing tricks, the way twilight could make ordinary things seem extraordinary. But as the figure moved closer, there was no denying what stood at the edge of their property. A bear, massive and dark against the fading light, stood perfectly still, its head tilted slightly as if listening. Lily instinctively moved toward Leo's crib, her maternal instincts firing, but something in the bear's posture stopped her. It wasn't threatening, it was waiting. The bear remained motionless for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. Its breathing, visible in the cold evening air, matched a rhythm that Ethan recognized immediately. It was the same pattern, the same pulse that had been emanating from Leo all day. He grabbed Lily's hand, squeezing it gently, neither of them daring to speak or move. The bear's eyes, barely visible in the growing darkness, seemed focused not on them, but on the small crib by the window where Leo lay. Then, as if satisfied with what it had seen or sensed, the bear turned and walked slowly back into the forest, each step deliberate and unhurried. That night, neither parent slept. They took turns sitting by Leo's crib, watching his peaceful face, feeling that persistent rhythm that now seemed to fill the entire cabin. Ethan researched everything he could find about bears in the area, their behavior patterns, their territorial habits, but nothing explained what they had witnessed. Lily found herself drawn to older sources, local folklore and indigenous stories about the mountains. One tale, barely mentioned in a tourism blog, spoke of guardian spirits that watched over the innocent, creating bonds that science couldn't measure. She read it aloud to Ethan, both of them trying to make sense of the impossible. The next morning arrived with a thick fog that wrapped around the cabin like a blanket. Leo woke happy, gurgling and reaching for the mobile above his crib, his heartbeat still carrying that dual rhythm. As Lily prepared his bottle, she noticed something outside the kitchen window. There, placed carefully on the porch railing, sat a perfectly intact pine cone, its scales arranged in a spiral pattern that seemed almost deliberate. Ethan went out to investigate, finding no tracks in the dew-covered deck, no sign of how it had been placed there. When he brought it inside, Leo's eyes immediately fixed on it, his tiny hands reaching out, his heartbeat quickening with what could only be described as recognition. They decided to take Leo outside, bundling him warmly against the morning chill. The moment they stepped onto the porch, the forest seemed to come alive. Birds that had been silent suddenly began singing, their songs creating a symphony that matched the rhythm they had become so familiar with. Leo's eyes were wide, taking in everything. His small body relaxed in a way that made him seem older, wiser than his 3 months. Lily walked to the edge of the porch, holding him up slightly so he could see the tree line better. That's when they heard it, a low rumble from somewhere deep in the forest, not threatening but acknowledging, like a greeting between old friends. Days passed, and the pattern continued. Every evening the bear would appear at the forest edge, maintaining its respectful distance but clearly present. Every morning they would find small offerings on the porch, pine cones, smooth stones, once a beautiful blue feather that made Leo laugh for the first time. His development seemed accelerated in subtle ways. He was more alert, more responsive, his eyes tracking movement with an intelligence that surprised even their pediatrician during a video consultation. The doctor found nothing wrong. In fact, she commented on how remarkably healthy Leo appeared. His vitals perfect. His growth right on track. Ethan started documenting everything, creating a journal of observations that read like fiction even to him. He noted the times the bear appeared, always synchronized with Leo's deepest sleep cycles. He recorded the items left on the porch, trying to find patterns or meanings. Lily focused on Leo's responses, how his mood shifted with the weather, how he seemed to know when the bear was near even before they could see it. She noticed that during thunderstorms, when most babies would cry, Leo would become incredibly calm, his heartbeat slowing to match the rhythm of the rain on the roof. One particularly clear night, when the moon was full and bright, they witnessed something that challenged everything they thought they knew about the natural world. Leo had been fussy all day, unusual for him now, refusing to settle for his afternoon nap. As bedtime approached, his agitation grew, small whimpers escaping despite Lily's best efforts to soothe him. Then, from the forest, came a sound they had never heard before. It was singing, or something like it, a low, melodious hum that seemed to rise from the earth itself. The bear was there, closer than ever before, sitting on its haunches like a person might sit in meditation. The sound was coming from it, a vocalization that bears shouldn't be able to make, yet there it was, undeniable and beautiful. Leo's crying stopped instantly. His eyes found the window, his tiny body relaxing as the strange lullaby continued. The bear sang. There was no other word for it. For nearly an hour, the sound weaving through the night air like a physical thing. Ethan recorded it on his phone, but when he played it back later, the audio was distorted, as if the frequency was beyond what the device could capture. All that remained was a faint humming, like wind through a hollow tree, beautiful but missing the profound depth of what they had heard. The next day, Lily decided they needed answers, or at least context. She drove to the nearest town, about 40 minutes down the mountain, and visited the small library. The librarian, an elderly woman named Margaret, who had lived in the area her entire life, listened to Lily's carefully edited version of events with knowing eyes. Without saying a word, she disappeared into a back room, returning with a leather-bound journal that looked older than the library itself. Inside were handwritten accounts dating back over a century, all describing similar experiences. Families who had lived on the mountain reported unexplainable connections between their children and the forest, bonds that defied logic but brought profound peace. Margaret told Lily about her own grandmother, who had spoken of a covenant between the mountain and its people. She said that sometimes, rarely, a child would be born who could hear the old songs, the rhythms that existed before human language. These children were considered blessed, protected by the mountain's ancient guardians. The bears, Margaret explained, were not just animals in these stories. They were keepers of something older, something that connected all living things in ways that modern science had forgotten how to measure. Lily listened, part of her skeptical, part of her recognizing truth in the old woman's words. When Lily returned to the cabin, she found Ethan sitting on the porch with Leo, both of them facing the forest. The baby was making soft cooing sounds, and from somewhere in the trees came answering calls, not from the bear, but from birds, from the wind itself, it seemed. Ethan looked up at her with wonder in his eyes. He had been sitting there for an hour, he said, just listening to Leo communicate with something he couldn't fully understand. The baby would make a sound, and the forest would respond, creating a conversation that transcended species, transcended logic. That evening, they made a decision. Instead of fighting or fearing what was happening, they would embrace it. They moved Leo's crib closer to the window, where he could see the forest clearly. They left the curtains open, allowing the moonlight and starlight to fill his room. Almost immediately, Leo's sleep deepened, his breathing taking on that familiar rhythm that now felt like home to them. The bear appeared, as expected, but this time it came closer, close enough that they could see its eyes clearly in the moonlight. They were gentle eyes, intelligent and ancient, filled with a wisdom that made Ethan's scientific mind real. The bear sat beneath Leo's window for hours that night, occasionally making soft huffing sounds that seemed to comfort the baby even in his sleep. Lily and Ethan took turns watching, documenting this impossible relationship that was unfolding before them. They noticed that Leo's development continued to accelerate in subtle ways. He was attempting to crawl weeks earlier than expected, his movements purposeful and directed always toward the window, toward the forest. His babbling had taken on a musical quality, rising and falling in patterns that matched the wind in the trees. One morning, they woke to find the bear had left something different on the porch. It was a small piece of honeycomb, perfectly clean and glistening with morning dew. When they brought it inside, Leo's reaction was immediate and profound. He laughed, really laughed, a sound so pure and joyful that both parents found themselves crying. The baby reached for the honeycomb with determination, and when Lily let him touch it just briefly, his whole body seemed to glow with happiness. The rhythm in his chest intensified, and for a moment they could actually see it, a faint, pulsing light beneath his skin, beautiful and impossible. Ethan's scientific mind struggled with what they were witnessing. He had been raised to believe in facts, in measurable phenomena, in cause and effect. Yet here was his son, connected to a wild bear through some invisible thread that science had no name for. He spent hours researching quantum entanglement, morphic fields, any theory that might explain what they were experiencing. But each explanation felt inadequate, like trying to describe a symphony using only mathematical equations. Some things, he was beginning to understand, existed beyond the reach of current human knowledge. The local doctor, whom they finally consulted in person, could find nothing unusual about Leo's physical condition. His heart was healthy, his development normal, even advanced in some areas. When they carefully mentioned the unusual rhythm, the doctor smiled and said that mountain children often developed differently, that the altitude and clean air could cause interesting but harmless variations. He didn't seem surprised or concerned, which both reassured and frustrated them. It was as if everyone who lived near the mountain knew something they didn't, some secret that was felt rather than spoken. As summer turned to autumn, the bond between Leo and the bear only grew stronger. The bear began bringing different offerings, each one seeming to correspond to Leo's developmental stages. When the baby began teething, the bear left smooth, cool stones that were perfect for gum relief. When Leo started eating solid foods, small piles of berries appeared, always fresh, always perfectly ripe. It was as if the bear understood the child's needs before even his parents did. One afternoon, while Ethan was working from home and Lily was preparing lunch, they heard Leo laughing in his playpen. When they looked, they saw him standing, actually standing, holding onto the rails and bouncing with excitement. Outside the window, the bear was doing something they had never seen before. It was playing, rolling in the fallen leaves, tossing them into the air with an almost childlike joy. Leo was mimicking the movements as best he could, his tiny body swaying in rhythm with the bear's play. It was a dance of sorts, a celebration of life that transcended the barrier between them. The first time Leo spoke, it wasn't mama or dada as they had expected. It was a sound that had no equivalent in human language, a low musical hum that made the windows vibrate slightly. The bear, who hadn't been visible all day, suddenly appeared at the forest edge, its head raised as if answering a call. Leo repeated the sound, and the bear responded with its own vocalization, creating a dialogue that left both parents speechless. Their son was speaking, just not in any language they recognized. Lily began to notice that she could feel it too, the rhythm that connected Leo to the forest. It started as a faint awareness, like knowing it was about to rain before the clouds appeared. But, as weeks passed, it grew stronger. She could sense when the bear was approaching, feel the forest's mood through some inexplicable connection. Ethan experienced it differently, as a kind of clarity that came during their evening walks. Problems that had seemed complex would suddenly have obvious solutions, as if the mountain itself was sharing its ancient wisdom. They started taking Leo out more, carrying him on hiking trails that wound through the forest. The baby was always calm during these walks, his eyes taking in everything with an awareness that seemed beyond his age. Other hikers they met would often comment on how alert and peaceful he seemed, though they had no idea of the true depth of his connection to these woods. Sometimes they would catch glimpses of the bear following at a distance, maintaining its protective watch even as they ventured deeper into its territory. One day, they discovered a clearing they had never seen before, despite having hiked these trails many times. In the center was an old stone formation, not quite a circle, but clearly, deliberately arranged. Leo became excited the moment they entered the space, his arms reaching out, his voice making those strange humming sounds that had become so familiar. The bear emerged from the opposite side of the clearing, moving slowly, deliberately, until it sat just outside the stone formation. For the first time, it looked directly at Ethan and Lily, really looked at them, and in its eyes they saw recognition, acceptance, and something that could only be described as gratitude. They sat in that clearing for hours, Leo playing with sticks and leaves while the bear watched, occasionally making soft sounds that made the baby laugh. Lily found herself crying without knowing why, tears of joy or overwhelm, or perhaps just the recognition of being part of something so much larger than herself. Ethan held her hand, his scientific mind finally quiet, accepting that some things didn't need explanation to be real and profound. As Leo's first birthday approached, the rhythmic connection had become so much a part of their lives that they couldn't imagine existing without it. The baby was walking now, with a confidence that surprised everyone who met him. He would toddle to the window each evening, placing his small hands on the glass, waiting for his friend to appear. The bear always came, as reliable as the sunset, sitting in what had become its usual spot, maintaining the vigil that had begun almost a year ago. The birthday itself was magical in ways they couldn't have planned. They had invited a few local families, people who had become friends over the months, all of whom seemed to understand without being told that something special was happening at the cabin. As they sang Happy Birthday, the forest itself seemed to join in. Birds gathered in unusual numbers, their songs harmonizing with the human voices. The wind picked up, rustling the leaves in a rhythm that matched the celebration. And there, at the edge of the forest, the bear sat watching, a silent participant in the joy. That night, after the guests had left and Leo was asleep, Lily and Ethan sat on the porch, reflecting on the year that had passed. They had come to the mountain seeking peace and had found something infinitely more profound. Their son was connected to this place in a way that defied explanation, protected by a guardian they never could have imagined. The rhythm that had once seemed strange now felt essential, like the heartbeat of the earth itself flowing through their child. As if reading their thoughts, the bear emerged from the darkness one more time. But tonight was different. It came closer than ever before, close enough that they could have touched it if they dared. It sat at the bottom of the porch steps, its massive head level with where they sat. For a long moment, all three beings simply existed together, sharing a silence that said more than words ever could. Then the bear did something extraordinary. It lowered its head in what could only be described as a bow, a gesture of respect and acknowledgement, before turning and walking back into the forest. Inside the cabin, Leo stirred in his sleep, his small voice humming that mysterious tune that had become the soundtrack of their lives. The rhythm in his chest pulsed strong and steady, a beacon of connection that linked him to something ancient and protective. Lily went to check on him, finding him peaceful, his tiny hand clutched around the pine cone that had been the first gift from his guardian. She adjusted his blanket, kissed his forehead, and felt the pulse of that otherworldly rhythm pass between them, mother to child to forest, and back again. The seasons continued to change, and with them came new developments in Leo's remarkable journey. He began to demonstrate an uncanny ability to predict weather changes, becoming restless hours before storms arrived, calm and content when good weather was approaching. The bear's visits adjusted accordingly, sometimes appearing multiple times in a single day when Leo seemed to need extra comfort. Other times, staying away for days when the child was particularly content and engaged with his human world. Local people started to share their own stories with Ethan and Lily, tales that had been kept quiet for generations. They learned about other children over the decades who had exhibited similar connections, though none quite as strong as Leo's. These children, they were told, often grew up to be remarkable individuals, not famous necessarily, but people who seemed to understand life in deeper ways, who brought peace to difficult situations, who could calm wild animals and soothe troubled hearts. It was as if the mountain chose certain souls to carry its wisdom forward into the human world. The bear began to bring other forest creatures to the edge of the clearing. Deer would graze peacefully while Leo played in the yard. Rabbits would hop closer than they should. Birds would land on the porch railing and sing directly to the child. It was as if Leo was recognized as part of the forest community, a bridge between the human and natural worlds. Ethan documented it all, though he had long since given up trying to find scientific explanations. Some things, he had learned, were meant to be experienced rather than understood. One particularly memorable evening, during a full moon, they witnessed something that would stay with them forever. Leo, now almost 2, had been particularly vocal all day, making his mysterious sounds with increasing frequency and intensity. As darkness fell, the bear appeared, but it wasn't alone. Behind it, barely visible in the shadows, were 2 cubs. The mother bear sat in her usual spot while the cubs played at the forest edge, their movements playful and innocent. Leo watched from the window, his whole body trembling with excitement, his voice creating a constant stream of those unusual vocalizations that seemed to delight the cubs. The mother bear allowed this interaction for nearly an hour before leading her cubs back into the forest. But before disappearing completely, one of the cubs broke away and ran back toward the cabin, stopping just short of the porch. It stood on its hind legs, mimicking a position Leo often took at the window, and made a sound that was unmistakably an attempt at mimicking Leo's unique vocalizations. Then it scampered back to its mother, and all 3 bears vanished into the darkness. Leo slept deeply that night, his dreams seemingly filled with pleasant visions that made him smile and occasionally laugh in his sleep. As Leo grew, so did his vocabulary, though it remained a mixture of human words and those strange forest sounds that only the bears seemed to understand. He would tell his parents about his dreams where he ran through the forest on all 4s, where he understood the language of trees, where the bear taught him ancient songs that had no human translation. Lily and Ethan listened to these stories with wonder, no longer questioning their reality, but simply accepting them as part of their son's unique experience of the world. The connection began to influence their own lives in unexpected ways. Ethan found his work as a consultant becoming more intuitive, his ability to solve complex problems enhanced by the clarity he found in the forest rhythm. Lily's art, which she had taken up since moving to the mountains, began to reflect patterns and movements that seemed to capture something essential about the natural world. People who saw her paintings often commented that they felt peaceful just looking at them. as if the canvases carried some of the mountain's tranquility. They learned to trust the rhythm, to let it guide their decisions. When Leo was 3, they considered moving back to the city for better educational opportunities. But the moment they seriously discussed it, the rhythm faltered. Leo became distressed. The bear didn't appear for 3 days, and the forest itself seemed to withdraw. The message was clear. This was where they belonged, where Leo needed to be. They abandoned the idea immediately, and that very night the bear returned with the largest gathering of forest creatures they had ever seen, as if celebrating their decision to stay. The local school, when Leo was old enough to attend, proved to be surprisingly accommodating. The teachers, many of whom had grown up in the area, seemed to intuitively understand that Leo was different. They allowed him to take breaks when the rhythm became too strong, to step outside and ground himself in the natural world. His classmates, rather than finding him strange, were drawn to his calm presence. He became known as the child who could calm crying babies, who could coax wild birds to eat from his hand, who always knew when someone needed comfort. But it was at home, in the presence of his guardian, that Leo truly flourished. The bear, now showing signs of age with gray creeping into its muzzle, maintained its faithful watch. The bond between them had evolved from mystery to acceptance, to something approaching understanding. They had developed a complex communication system, a combination of sounds, gestures, and that ever-present rhythm that allowed them to share information in ways that transcended normal interaction. One autumn evening, when Leo was 5, something shifted. The bear appeared as usual but seemed different, more urgent in its movements. It paced at the forest edge, making low sounds that Ethan and Lily had never heard before. Leo immediately went to the window, pressing both hands against the glass, his own vocalizations taking on a worried tone. Then they saw why the bear was distressed. Behind it, limping badly, was one of the cubs from years before, now a young adult bear, injured and clearly in pain. Without hesitation, Leo ran for the door. Lily caught him just in time, her maternal instincts overwhelming even her trust in the guardian bear. But Leo looked at her with eyes that seemed ancient, wise beyond his years, and said in perfect clarity, "He needs help, Mama. The forest is asking." The certainty in his voice, the depth of knowledge it carried, made her release him. Ethan grabbed the first aid kit, though he had no idea what use it would be for a bear, and they all went onto the porch. What happened next defied every instinct they had about wild animals. The injured bear, guided by its mother, came onto the porch, actually onto the human space, and lay down. Leo approached without fear, his small hands moving over the bear's fur until he found the source of injury, a deep gash probably from a territorial fight. He began to hum, that low, mysterious sound that had marked his first year of life, and the injured bear immediately calmed. While Leo continued his strange healing song, Ethan was able to clean and treat the wound, the bear remaining impossibly still throughout. When they finished, the mother bear did something extraordinary. She approached Leo, who stood barely as tall as her shoulder when she was on all fours, and gently touched her nose to his forehead. It was a gesture of such tenderness, such clear gratitude, that Lily found herself sobbing. The bears left that night, but the connection had deepened beyond anything they had experienced before. Leo had become not just a friend to the forest, but a healer, a bridge between worlds that normally never touched. The story of Leo's healing spread through the local community, though it was spoken of in whispers, in the same way people might discuss miracles or magic. More families began to bring their children to play with Leo, hoping some of his connection to the natural world might influence them. And it did, in small ways. Children who spent time with Leo became calmer, more observant, more connected to the rhythms of nature. It was as if his gift was contagious, spreading peace wherever he went. As Leo grew older, his abilities evolved. He could predict not just weather, but other natural events. He knew when the salmon would run, when the berries would be ripest, when the mountain passes would be safe for travel. The bear, his constant guardian, began bringing him teaching gifts, things that seemed designed to educate him about the forest. Bones that showed anatomy, different types of bark and leaves, stones with fossils embedded in them. It was an education no school could provide. Knowledge passed down through a connection that predated human civilization. By the time Leo was 7, the rhythm had become so integrated into their family life that they couldn't imagine existing without it. Ethan had written a book about their experiences, though he published it as fiction, knowing the truth would be too much for most people to accept. Lily's art had gained recognition, her paintings of the forest and its creatures carrying something ineffable that drew people from around the world. And Leo himself had become something of a local legend, the boy who spoke with bears, who carried the forest's heartbeat in his chest. But perhaps the most remarkable thing was how normal it all felt now. The impossible had become routine. The miraculous had become mundane. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching Leo and the bear communicate in their unique way, and it felt as natural as watching any child play with a beloved pet. The rhythm that had once seemed so foreign now felt like home, a constant reminder that they were part of something vast and interconnected. One spring morning, when Leo was 8, the bear didn't appear. They waited all day, Leo growing increasingly agitated as the hours passed. That night, he had a dream, which he described to his parents with tears streaming down his face. The bear was old, he said, older than they had realized. It had held on, maintaining its guardian role far longer than nature typically allowed, driven by a purpose that transcended normal animal behavior. But its time was coming to an end, and it needed to pass on its role to another. The next evening, the bear appeared one last time, but it wasn't alone. With it was a younger bear, strong and healthy, with intelligent eyes that seemed to already know Leo. The old bear, moving slowly but with dignity, brought the younger one forward, clearly presenting it to the family. Leo ran outside, dropping to his knees in front of his old friend, his small arms wrapping around the massive neck in their first and only physical embrace. The bear rumbled softly, a sound of contentment and completion, then slowly walked back into the forest, leaving the younger bear in its place. They never saw the old bear again, though Leo said he could still feel it sometimes, in the wind, in the rhythm that continued to pulse through his chest. The young bear took up the role of guardian seamlessly, maintaining the same respectful distance, bringing the same thoughtful gifts, singing the same impossible songs that helped Leo sleep. The transition felt both heartbreaking and natural, a reminder that even magical connections existed within the cycles of life and death. As Leo entered his preteen years, his understanding of his gift deepened. He began to speak about responsibility, about being a bridge between worlds that were growing further apart. He talked about how the forest was changing, how human development was affecting the delicate balance that had existed for centuries. His guardian bear seemed to sense this too, its visit sometimes carrying an urgency that hadn't existed before. Together, they seemed to be preparing for something, though neither Ethan nor Lily could guess what that might be. The rhythm that connected them all began to extend beyond their immediate family. Visitors to the cabin would often comment on feeling unusually peaceful, some even claiming they could hear music in the wind. Local wildlife became increasingly comfortable around human spaces, as if Leo's influence was spreading throughout the entire mountain region. It was subtle, but undeniable, a softening of the boundaries between civilization and wilderness. 2 chapters of Part 1 completed. Years had passed since that first night when they noticed the strange rhythm in baby Leo's heartbeat. And now, as he approached his 10th birthday, the full magnitude of his gift was becoming apparent. The young guardian bear had grown into its role magnificently, developing its own unique relationship with Leo that, while different from the first bear's paternal watchfulness, was equally profound. This bear was more playful, more willing to engage in what could only be described as games, complex interactions that seemed to be teaching Leo about strategy, patience, and the intricate balance of predator and prey, though no hunting ever occurred. The forest itself had accepted the Marshall Morgan family as a part of its ecosystem. Trails seemed to open for them that other hikers couldn't find. Streams would run clear when they needed water. And dangerous animals would give them wide berth while allowing remarkably close encounters with typically shy creatures. Leo could walk through a meadow and have butterflies land on him in such numbers that he looked like he was wearing a living, fluttering coat. Birds would follow him on his walks to school, creating a singing escort that delighted and mystified his classmates. At school, Leo's unique gifts had evolved into a kind of gentle leadership. Without trying, he had become the child others turned to when they were upset or confused. His presence alone could calm a chaotic classroom. His soft humming, those same mysterious tones from his infancy, could soothe crying children and even influence the mood of adults. His teachers had learned to recognize when Leo was picking up on some disturbance in the natural world. His distraction not disobedience, but rather an attunement to signals the rest of them couldn't perceive. One particularly significant event occurred during a school field trip to a local nature preserve. The class had been learning about local ecosystems, and the guide was explaining the delicate balance of forest life when a young deer, clearly injured and terrified, burst into the clearing where the children were gathered. Most of the kids screamed and scattered, but Leo stepped forward, his hands extended, making those low musical sounds that his family knew so well. The deer, against all natural instinct, calmed immediately, allowing Leo to approach and examine a deep cut on its leg, likely from a fence or sharp branch. What happened next became legend in their small mountain town. Leo placed his hands on the wound and began to sing. Really sing, in a language that seemed to bypass the ears and speak directly to the soul. The forest around them grew silent, as if every living thing was listening. The deer's breathing slowed, its eyes half closing in what looked like bliss. When Leo finally stepped back, the wound hadn't miraculously healed, but it had stopped bleeding, and the deer was calm enough for the preserve rangers to approach and provide proper medical treatment. The other children looked at Leo with a mixture of awe and a little fear, finally understanding that their classmate was touched by something beyond their comprehension. That evening, the guardian bear appeared earlier than usual, accompanied by several deer, including, Ethan was certain, the one from the field trip. The animals arranged themselves in the clearing like an audience, and Leo, without being asked, went outside and sat in their midst. For hours, he communicated with them in that wordless way he had developed, occasionally laughing at some shared joke only he could understand, sometimes growing serious as if receiving important information. Lily and Ethan watched from the porch, holding hands, marveling at the child they had brought into the world who now seemed to belong equally to another realm entirely. The guardian bear had begun teaching Leo more complex lessons. They would disappear into the forest together for hours, Leo always returning safely, but changed in subtle ways. He would come back knowing things he shouldn't know, like where a rare medicinal plant grew, or that a storm was coming 3 days before the weather service predicted it, or that a neighbor's lost cat was hiding in a specific hollow tree 2 miles away. The bear was passing on knowledge that had no human equivalent, wisdom accumulated over generations of forest dwelling that was being entrusted to a human child for reasons they were only beginning to understand. One day, Leo came home from one of these forest sessions with a serious expression. He told his parents that the bear had shown him something important, something about the future. The mountain was changing, he said, not just from development, but from something larger, a shift in the Earth's rhythm itself. The old connections between the human and natural worlds were weakening everywhere except here, in this small pocket of mountain wilderness where their family had become an anchor point. Leo's role, the bear had somehow communicated, was to be a reminder, a living bridge that proved the old connections were still possible. This revelation led to long family discussions about responsibility and purpose. Ethan, ever the pragmatist even after all he had witnessed, worried about the burden being placed on his young son. But Leo seemed to carry it lightly, with a wisdom that belied his years. He explained that it wasn't a burden, but a gift, that feeling the forest's rhythm, understanding the language of animals, being part of something so vast and interconnected, was the most natural thing in the world. The real burden, he said with surprising insight, was that most people had forgotten how to feel it. As Leo's abilities grew, so did the challenges of keeping them relatively private. Word had spread beyond their small community, and occasionally strangers would appear, some genuinely curious, others skeptical, and looking to debunk what they saw as rural superstition. Ethan and Lily became fiercely protective, creating boundaries and stories that satisfied curiosity without revealing the full truth. They said Leo had a way with animals, which was true but vastly understated. They acknowledged the presence of bears on their property, but described them as merely tolerant of humans, rather than actively connected to their son. The guardian bear seemed to understand the need for discretion as well. When strangers were present, it would remain hidden, though Leo always knew it was there, watching from the deep forest. Only when the family was alone would it resume its regular visits, its teachings, its strange communion with the boy who carried the forest's heartbeat in his chest. This dance of revelation and concealment became another part of their rhythm, as natural as breathing. One winter, when Leo was 11, something unprecedented happened. The guardian bear didn't go into hibernation. It remained active all winter, visiting daily, sometimes bringing other bears with it. Leo explained that something important was happening, a gathering of sorts, though he couldn't quite articulate what it meant. The bears would sit in the snow-covered clearing, sometimes a dozen or more, all focused on Leo as he stood among them, his young voice carrying those ancient sounds across the frozen landscape. During this gathering, Leo's abilities took another leap forward. He began to have visions, not of the future exactly, but of the interconnected web of life across the entire mountain range. He could sense when a tree was diseased miles away, feel when the underground streams changed course, know when the delicate balance of predator and prey was disrupted. It was overwhelming at first, and there were days when he would have to stay home from school, curled in his bed, processing the vast amount of information flowing through him. Lily and Ethan could only support him as best they could, providing comfort during the intense periods and normalcy when he needed grounding in the human world. They had long since accepted that their son was living between two realities, and their job was to help him navigate both. They became students themselves, learning from Leo about the subtle signs of forest health, the meaning of different animal behaviors, the way the rhythm of life pulsed through everything if you just knew how to feel it. The spring following the winter gathering brought a new development. Other families with similar connections began to reach out, not publicly, but through quiet channels, word of mouth, careful introductions. They learned that Leo wasn't entirely unique, that throughout history there had been children like him, bridges between worlds, though perhaps none with such a clear and powerful connection. These families formed a loose network, sharing experiences and wisdom, creating a support system for children who didn't quite fit in the normal world. Through this network, they met an elderly indigenous woman named Sarah, who lived on the other side of the mountain. She came to visit Leo, and the moment she saw him, she began to cry. She said he carried the old medicine, the connection her people had maintained for thousands of years before it was nearly lost. She spent hours with Leo, teaching him stories that complemented what the bear had shown him, giving human context to the wild wisdom he had absorbed. She said Leo was part of a prophecy she had heard as a child, about children who would emerge when the world needed to remember its connection to the living earth. Sarah's visits became regular, and she brought with her a deeper understanding of what Leo was experiencing. She taught the family about the responsibility that came with such gifts, about the importance of staying grounded while being open to the mystical. She showed Leo how to protect himself when the flow of information became too intense, techniques her ancestors had developed over millennia. Most importantly, she helped him understand that his gift wasn't just about him or even his family, but about keeping alive a way of being that the modern world was rapidly forgetting. The guardian bear seemed to approve of Sarah's presence, often appearing when she visited, sitting at the forest edge like a silent participant in the lessons. Sarah would nod to it respectfully, sometimes speaking to it in her native language, and the bear would respond with subtle movements that suggested understanding. It was during one of these visits that Sarah revealed something remarkable. The bears of this mountain had been guardians for her people long before European settlers arrived, and the connection Leo had was a continuation of something ancient and sacred. This knowledge transformed how the family understood their situation. They weren't experiencing something new, but were part of a tradition that stretched back through time, a thread of connection that had never been completely severed. Ethan began researching historical accounts with new purpose, finding hidden references to similar relationships throughout human history, always spoken of in whispers, always on the margins of official records. Lily's art evolved to incorporate symbols and patterns Sarah taught them, creating works that seemed to carry power beyond mere aesthetics. As Leo entered adolescence, his connection to the guardian bear and the forest began to manifest in new ways. He developed what could only be described as healing abilities, not miraculous or instantaneous, but a capacity to accelerate natural healing processes, to calm inflammation, to ease pain through touch and those mysterious vocalizations. Word of this spread despite their attempts at discretion, and people began to come seeking help, usually for their animals at first, then tentatively for themselves. The family had to make difficult decisions about how to handle these requests. They couldn't turn away genuine need, but they also couldn't become a spectacle. They developed a system, seeing a limited number of people, never accepting payment, always emphasizing that Leo was simply facilitating the body's own healing processes. The guardian bear would always absent itself during these sessions, but Leo said he could feel its support, its strength flowing through the connection they shared. One particularly powerful healing session involved a young girl from town who had been traumatized by a car accident and hadn't spoken in months. Her parents, desperate and having heard rumors about Leo's gifts, brought her to the cabin. Leo spent an entire afternoon with her, not forcing interaction but simply being present, occasionally humming his forest songs. As the sun began to set, the guardian bear appeared at the forest edge, and the girl's eyes widened with wonder rather than fear. Leo took her hand and led her to the window, and together they watched the bear, Leo making soft sounds that the bear answered. When the girl finally spoke, it was to say, "It's singing," and her parents wept with relief. These healings, these connections took a toll on Leo. He would need days of solitude afterward, time spent in the forest with his guardian, recharging and rebalancing. The family learned to recognize the signs of when he was depleted and needed to withdraw. During these times, the forest itself seemed to cocoon him, providing extra protection and nourishment. Animals would bring him gifts, streams would sing more sweetly where he rested, and the very air seemed to sparkle with supportive energy. As Leo's 13th birthday approached, both he and the guardian bear seemed to sense another shift coming. The bear began bringing unusual gifts, objects that seemed to have significance beyond their physical form. A perfectly preserved butterfly wing, a stone with natural holes that created music when the wind passed through, a piece of bark with patterns that looked like ancient writing. Leo kept these treasures in a special box, saying they were messages he didn't yet fully understand but would when the time was right. The birthday itself was marked by an extraordinary event. As the family celebrated quietly, just the three of them with a simple cake, the forest exploded with life. Every bird for miles seemed to converge on their property, singing in harmonious chaos. Deer, rabbits, foxes, even a few cautious coyotes emerged from the forest, creating a living mandala around the cabin. And at the center of it all sat the guardian bear, its eyes locked on Leo with an expression of such profound pride and affection that it transcended species entirely. That night, Leo had a vision that he shared with his parents the next morning. He had seen himself as an adult, still connected to the forest but in a different way. He was teaching others, many others, helping them rediscover their own connections to the natural world. The guardian bear was still there but older, grayer, and there were other human forest bridges, a network of people maintaining the old connections across the world. It wasn't a certain future, he explained, but a possible one, dependent on choices yet to be made. This vision gave the family a new sense of purpose. They began to document everything more carefully, not for scientific publication, but as a record for those who might come after. Ethan wrote detailed accounts of their experiences. Lily painted the scenes that couldn't be captured in photographs. And Leo himself began to write in a journal, his entries a mixture of human language and symbols that seemed to come from his forest education. They were creating an archive of impossible things, a testament to the connections that shouldn't exist, but did. The guardian bear's teachings became more urgent as Leo grew older, as if it was trying to impart as much knowledge as possible before some deadline only it knew. Leo learned to read the health of the forest through subtle signs invisible to others, to predict weather patterns weeks in advance, to understand the complex social dynamics of various animal groups. But more than practical knowledge, the bear was teaching him something deeper: how to be a guardian himself, how to protect the delicate threads that connected all living things. One summer evening, when the air was thick with the scent of pine and wildflowers, the guardian bear did something unprecedented. It brought Leo a cub, not its own, but an orphan it had apparently been caring for. The cub was tiny, probably only a few months old, and the guardian bear gently pushed it toward Leo with clear intent. This wasn't just an introduction, it was a passing of responsibility. Leo understood immediately, though the full implications would take time to unfold. He was being asked to help raise this cub, to be part of its education just as the bears had been part of his. The presence of the cub changed everything. It would spend hours with Leo, playing in ways that were both typically bear-like and strangely human-influenced. Leo taught it his songs, and remarkably, the cub learned to approximate them, creating its own versions that made the guardian bear rumble with what could only be described as amusement. The cub became a bridge within a bridge, connecting the human and bear worlds even more intimately than before. Watching Leo with the cub was like watching two children from different species discover they spoke the same language of play and wonder. They would roll in the grass together, the cub careful with its claws, Leo matching its movements with surprising grace. They would sit together for hours, Leo reading from his school books while the cub listened with apparent interest, occasionally pawing at the pictures. It was a friendship that defied every natural law, yet felt like the most natural thing in the world. The local community had long since stopped questioning the strange occurrences at the Marshall Morgan cabin. It had become part of the local lore, accepted and protected by an unspoken agreement. Newcomers might express skepticism, but longtime residents would simply smile and change the subject, understanding that some things were better left unexplained. The town had developed its own rhythm around the family, giving them space while also embracing them as part of the community's unique character. As autumn arrived that year, painting the mountains in brilliant reds and golds, the family noticed the guardian bear moving more slowly, spending longer periods resting when it visited. Leo grew concerned, but the bear seemed at peace, its eyes still bright with intelligence and affection. It began to spend more time teaching the cub, showing it the boundaries of the territory, the safe paths through the forest, the places where humans could be trusted. It was preparing its successor, ensuring the continuation of a guardianship that had already spanned generations. One crisp morning, Leo woke with tears on his face. He had dreamed of the first guardian bear, the one who had watched over him as an infant. In the dream, it had shown him a vast web of light connecting every living thing on the mountain, with certain points glowing brighter than others. His family's cabin was one of those bright points, a node in a network of connection that stretched beyond the physical into something more fundamental. The dream bear had touched his forehead, just as it had done years ago, and Leo had understood that his role was to keep that point of light burning, to ensure the connections remained strong for future generations. When he shared this dream with his parents, they realized together that their story was far from over. If anything, it was just beginning. Leo was growing into his role, not just as a bridge between worlds, but as a teacher, a healer, a guardian of ancient knowledge that the modern world desperately needed to remember. The rhythm that had started in his infant heartbeat had become a symphony, conducted by forces beyond human understanding but not beyond human experience. The guardian bear continued its visits through the winter, the orphan cub growing rapidly under its tutelage and Leo's companionship. The three of them, boy, elder bear, and cub, formed an unlikely trinity, each teaching the others in ways that enriched all their lives. Visitors who were lucky enough to witness their interactions often left changed, carrying with them a seed of understanding that would grow in its own time, spreading the awareness that the connections between human and nature were not lost, just forgotten, waiting to be remembered. As spring returned to the mountains, bringing with it the promise of new growth and renewal, the Marshall Morgan family stood on their porch, watching Leo communicate with his Ursine family. The teenage boy who had once been a baby with a mysterious heartbeat now stood tall and confident, his voice carrying those ancient songs across the clearing, where bears and humans had learned to trust each other. The rhythm that connected them all pulsed strong and steady, a heartbeat shared between species, a reminder that in this small corner of the world, the impossible remained beautifully, mysteriously possible. The guardian bear rose on its hind legs, a position it rarely took, and Leo matched it, standing as tall as his human frame allowed. For a moment, they stood facing each other, two beings from different worlds united by something greater than either of them. Then the bear dropped back to all fours and ambled toward the forest, the cub following. But not before both turned back to look at Leo one more time. He raised his hand in farewell, knowing they would return, as they always did, drawn by the rhythm that bound them all together. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of pink and gold, Lily found Leo sitting in his room, writing in his journal. The symbols he used were becoming more complex, a written language that seemed to capture concepts English couldn't express. When she asked what he was writing, he smiled and said he was documenting the day's lessons, the subtle teachings the forest had provided. He was creating a codex of sorts, a guide for others who might one day need to understand the old connections. The cub had shown him something important that day, Leo explained. It had led him to a grove of ancient trees he had never seen before, despite years of exploring the forest. In the center of the grove was a spring, its water so clear it seemed to glow with its own light. When Leo had knelt to drink from it, he had felt the entire history of the mountain flow through him, generations of guardians, both human and animal, who had protected this sacred space. He understood then that he was part of a lineage that stretched back to the beginning of human consciousness, when the boundary between human and nature was fluid and permeable. This revelation had come with a responsibility. The spring, the grove, the network of connections it represented, needed protection from forces that didn't understand its significance. Development was encroaching on the mountain, bringing with it people who saw only resources to be exploited, rather than relationships to be nurtured. Leo's role was evolving from bridge to protector, from student to teacher, from child to young guardian of ancient wisdom. Ethan had been researching legal protections for their land and the surrounding forest, working with environmental lawyers to establish conservation easements that would preserve the area for future generations. But he knew that legal protection was only part of the solution. The real protection came from people understanding the true value of what existed here, not just the ecosystem, but the living proof that humans and nature could coexist in profound harmony. The family began hosting small gatherings, carefully selected people who showed genuine interest in learning about sustainable living and human-nature connections. During these gatherings, Leo would share what he could, teaching people to slow down and feel the rhythm that pulsed through everything. The guardian bear would sometimes make distant appearances during these events, just visible enough to remind participants that they were in the presence of something extraordinary. One visitor, a scientist named Dr. Rebecca Chen, who studied interspecies communication, became particularly intrigued by Leo's abilities. Rather than wanting to study him like a specimen, she approached with genuine respect and curiosity about how his gifts might help bridge the gap between scientific understanding and indigenous wisdom. She began documenting Leo's interactions with animals using non-invasive methods, creating a record that might one day help validate what traditional cultures had always known about human-animal connections. Dr. Chen's presence brought a new dimension to their understanding. She introduced concepts from quantum biology and consciousness studies that provided a framework for comprehending Leo's abilities without diminishing their mystery. She spoke of morphic fields and quantum entanglement, of the ways consciousness might extend beyond individual organisms to create collective awareness. While these theories didn't fully explain what Leo experienced, they offered a bridge between the mystical and the scientific that made the family feel less isolated in their extraordinary circumstances. The orphan cub, now growing into a strong young bear, had developed its own unique relationship with each family member. With Ethan, it was playfully respectful. often bringing him interesting objects from the forest, as if understanding his analytical nature. With Lily, it was gentle and affectionate, sometimes sitting quietly while she painted, seeming to appreciate the art she created. But with Leo, the relationship transcended typical understanding. They moved together like dance partners, each anticipating the other's actions, communicating in ways that required no sound or gesture. As Leo's 14th birthday approached, he began to speak of feeling a shift in the mountain's energy. The rhythm was changing, not weakening but evolving, as if preparing for something new. The guardian bear seemed to feel it too, its visits becoming more ceremonial, as if each one carried special significance. Even the forest itself seemed to be holding its breath, waiting for something none of them could quite identify. The birthday brought unexpected visitors. Throughout the day, animals emerged from the forest in unprecedented numbers, not just the usual deer and small creatures, but rare species seldom seen by humans. A mountain lion sat at the forest edge for hours, its presence causing no alarm among the other animals. Eagles circled overhead in patterns that seemed deliberate and meaningful. Even insects participated, butterflies and dragonflies creating living mandalas in the air around the cabin. That night, under a canopy of stars so bright they seemed within reach, the guardian bear led Leo deep into the forest to a place he had never been before. There, in a natural amphitheater formed by ancient rocks, dozens of bears had gathered. Not just black bears, but grizzlies too, species that normally avoided each other, all sitting in peaceful assembly. Leo stood in their midst, understanding without words that he was being formally recognized as a guardian of the old ways, a human member of an ancient council that had protected these mountains since time immemorial. When Leo returned hours later, he was changed. His parents could see it in his eyes, a depth of knowledge and responsibility that went beyond his years. He spoke of understanding now why he had been chosen, why the rhythm had marked him from birth. The world was at a tipping point, he explained, where the connections between human and nature would either be renewed or lost forever. His role, and the role of others like him around the world, was to hold the door open, to prove through living example that another way was possible. The guardian bear's health began to decline as winter approached. It moved more slowly, its breathing more labored, but its eyes remained bright with purpose. It spent increasing time with the young bear it had brought to Leo, passing on final lessons, ensuring the continuity of guardianship. Leo spent every possible moment with both bears, absorbing their wisdom, sharing his own human perspective, creating a synthesis of knowledge that belonged fully to neither world but drew from both. One snowy evening, the guardian bear made its final visit. It came alone, moving with difficulty but with dignity and tact. It sat in its usual spot, looking at the cabin where it had spent so many years maintaining its watch. Leo went out to sit with it, neither of them making a sound, just sharing presence in the falling snow. As the night deepened, the bear placed its massive paw on Leo's hand, a gesture of trust and farewell that needed no translation. Then it rose, looked once more at the family gathered on the porch, and walked into the forest for the last time. They found it the next morning, peaceful in a grove of ancient pines, having chosen its place of transition with the same wisdom it had shown in life. Leo led his family to the spot, and together they honored the bear's passing in a ceremony that combined human mourning with the forest's own rituals of renewal. The young bear was there too, maintaining a respectful distance but clearly taking on its new role as primary guardian. The passing of the guardian marked a transition for Leo as well. At 15, he was no longer a child discovering his gifts, but a young man growing into his purpose. He began to travel to other communities, always accompanied by family, sharing his knowledge with those ready to receive it. He met other young people with similar connections, forming a network of Earth guardians that spanned cultures and continents. But he always returned to the mountain, to the cabin where it all began, to the young bear who had become his closest non-human friend. Their bond had evolved beyond even what he had shared with the first guardian. This bear had grown up with human influence from the beginning, creating a hybrid understanding that was unprecedented. It could respond to human language to some degree, understanding not just tone, but actual words. It had learned to use tools in simple ways, influenced by watching the family's daily activities. The forest had accepted these changes, this evolution of the ancient compact between species. New patterns emerged in the local ecosystem, with animals showing increased cooperation across species lines, as if Leo's influence had awakened dormant possibilities for interspecies harmony. Predators still hunted, the cycle of life and death continued, but there was a new awareness, a recognition of shared existence that hadn't been there before. Scientists like Dr. Chen continued to document these changes, building a body of evidence that challenged conventional understanding of animal consciousness and communication. But for the Marshall Morgan family, the scientific validation was secondary to the lived experience of being part of something miraculous. Every day brought new wonders, small moments of connection that reinforced their understanding that the boundaries between human and nature were constructs that could be transcended. As Leo entered his final years of high school, he faced the challenge of balancing his forest life with the demands of the modern world. College applications asked about his interests and achievements. But how could he explain that his greatest accomplishment was learning to speak with bears? How could he put on a resume that he could feel the heartbeat of an entire mountain? He worked with his parents and teachers to frame his experiences in ways that would make sense to admissions committees while staying true to his reality. He wrote essays about environmental conservation, about the importance of preserving indigenous knowledge, about the need for new models of human-nature interaction. He spoke of his experiences in metaphors that conveyed truth without requiring belief in the impossible. Universities were intrigued by this young man who seemed to bridge worlds, who spoke with equal fluency about quantum physics and ancient forest wisdom. But even as he prepared for a future that might take him temporarily away from the mountain, Leo knew his true education was happening in the forest with his Ursine teacher. The young bear, now fully grown and magnificent, had developed its own teaching style, different from its predecessor but equally profound. Where the old guardian had been patient and gentle, this one was more dynamic, more willing to challenge Leo, to push him beyond his comfort zone. Together, they explored parts of the forest that had been forbidden before, places of power where the veil between worlds was particularly thin. Leo learned to navigate these spaces, to understand the responsibilities that came with accessing such places. He discovered that his ability to sync with the forest's rhythm allowed him to serve as a conduit for healing energy that could restore damaged ecosystems, though using this ability required careful balance to avoid depleting himself. One spring day, as Leo and the bear sat by the ancient spring he had discovered years earlier, a revelation came to him. The rhythm he had carried since birth wasn't just connecting him to this particular forest or these particular bears. It was part of a global heartbeat, a planetary consciousness that was struggling to maintain balance in the face of human disruption. His role wasn't just to be a bridge, but to be part of a larger healing, a resynchronization of human civilization with the natural rhythms of Earth. This understanding came with both hope and sobering responsibility. Leo realized that his generation would determine whether the old connections would survive into the future or be lost forever. But he wasn't alone. Through his travels and connections, he had met dozens of others like him, young people carrying different aspects of the ancient knowledge, each serving as a bridge in their own unique way. The bear seemed to understand this revelation, responding with a vocalization Leo had never heard before, a sound that seemed to carry approval and encouragement. They sat together as the sun set. Two unlikely friends whose bond had become a symbol of what was possible when humans remembered their place in the web of life. The rhythm pulsed between them, steady and strong, a heartbeat that belonged to neither and both, a promise that the connections would endure. As Leo's high school graduation approached, the forest prepared its own ceremony. Animals began gathering days in advance, creating an atmosphere of anticipation that even the most skeptical visitors could feel. The young guardian bear spent more time near the cabin, as if understanding that changes were coming. Leo himself felt the shift, a sense that one chapter of his life was ending and another beginning, though he knew the forest would always be his true home. The graduation ceremony at the local high school was small and intimate, but for Leo, the real ceremony happened that evening in the forest. He walked to the sacred grove with his family and the bear, finding it filled with more wildlife than he had ever seen assembled in one place. As he stood in the center, the animals began to vocalize, each species contributing its voice to create a symphony unlike anything human composers had imagined. It was their graduation gift to him, a recognition of his growth from the baby with the mysterious heartbeat to a young man ready to carry their message to the wider world. In that moment, surrounded by his human family and his forest family, Leo understood that his story was both ending and beginning. The boy who had synced with bear rhythms had become a young man who carried the heartbeat of an entire ecosystem. His journey would take him to universities and conferences, to places where people had forgotten such connections were possible. But he would always return to this mountain, to this cabin, to the bears who had raised him as much as his human parents had. The young guardian bear approached him as the forest symphony reached its crescendo, standing on its hind legs to match Leo's height. They embraced, a gesture that should have been impossible, dangerous even, but was instead perfectly natural for these two beings who had grown up together in the space between worlds. When they separated, Leo saw in the bear's eyes a reflection of his own understanding. They were partners in something larger than themselves, guardians of a possibility that the world desperately needed to remember. As the evening deepened into night, the assembled creatures began to disperse, each returning to their own territories and lives, but the connections remained. Invisible threads linking all who had participated in this moment. Leo stood with his parents, watching the young bear disappear into the forest, knowing it would return tomorrow as it always did. The rhythm in his chest beat strong and steady, no longer mysterious but still miraculous, a reminder that some bonds transcend explanation and exist simply because they must. The story that had begun with a baby's unusual heartbeat had evolved into something neither Ethan nor Lily could have imagined. Their son had become a bridge between worlds, a living proof that the separation between human and nature was an illusion that could be dissolved through love, respect, and deep listening. As they walked back to the cabin, the forest sang them home, every leaf and branch participating in the eternal rhythm that connected all things. Looking back, they could see how every moment had been leading to this, Leo's emergence as a guardian of ancient wisdom in a modern world. The bears had been teachers, certainly, but also partners in a dance of mutual evolution. Through their connection with Leo, they too had changed, become something new, ambassadors from the wild world to human consciousness. The rhythm that bound them all was not static but dynamic, evolving with each generation while maintaining its essential nature. As Leo prepared for the next phase of his journey, he knew that wherever he went, he would carry the forest with him. The rhythm in his chest would always connect him to the mountain, to the bears, to the vast web of life that had claimed him as its own from his first breath. He was no longer just Ethan and Lily's son, but a child of two worlds, raised by human love and wild wisdom in equal measure. The cabin stood in its clearing, surrounded by the ancient forest that had witnessed so much wonder. Inside, the Marshall Morgan family prepared for sleep, each carrying the rhythm in their own way now, infected by Leo's gift through years of proximity. Outside, the young guardian bear settled into its watching post, maintaining the vigil that connected past and future, human and wild, possible and impossible. The rhythm continued, as it always had and always would, a heartbeat shared between species, a reminder that in the grand symphony of life, every being had its part to play. Leo's story was one note in that symphony, but a crucial one, proving that the music could still be heard by those who remembered how to listen. As sleep took them, the family dreamed of forests and futures, of bears and bonds that defied explanation, of a world where the impossible became beautifully, mysteriously, eternally possible. In the years that followed, Leo's influence would spread far beyond the mountain. His unique understanding of interspecies connection would inspire new fields of study, new approaches to conservation, new ways of imagining human relationship with the natural world. But that night, he was simply a young man on the cusp of adulthood, carrying a rhythm in his chest that connected him to something vast and ancient and absolutely real. The bear's heartbeat and the boy's had become one rhythm, one song, one promise that the old connections would not be forgotten. In a world that had largely forgotten how to hear the music of the spheres, Leo and his Ursine family kept the melody alive, a beacon of hope that others might remember their own wild hearts and rejoin the eternal dance. As the moon rose over the mountain, casting silver light through the forest canopy, all was peaceful in the clearing where miracles had become commonplace. The rhythm pulsed on, steady and sure, a heartbeat that belonged to no one and everyone, a reminder that love could bridge any gap, even the one between human and bear, civilization and wilderness, the possible and the impossible.